my whole life has been caught up in economic theory, and I began my studies at university, having done it at school as well. And back at school, this is one of the signs I've seen of the degradation of university education over the last 40 years. The textbook we used at my high school in the late 1960s, early 1970s would be regarded as too difficult now for first-year students at university. It taught things like all the various structural concepts of economics were taught at that stage. And I ended up finding myself being quite a believer in the whole idea of markets being equilibrating systems that bring supply and demand into balance, and all the problems in the system are caused by non-market interventions. So you have trade unions, which mean wages are set too high, monopolies setting prices too high. And when I look back on that period of my life, I realised that what economic education did at that stage is it didn't make me into an analyst, it made me into a zealot. You have a vision of a perfect society, and you then see your role as bringing about that perfect society by changing the real world to resemble the system you see in your textbooks. Now, I was broken out of that very happily, very luckily, by a first-year university lecturer who himself had been through the whole process of believing in the theory, doing a PhD, thinking there's something crazy in the middle of all this, and then abandoning it. And then what he did was he read the literature and said, well, just how well-founded is this, not as a sort of a system of belief, but as a description of the real world. How valid is this? It's describing what would happen if you follow what the textbooks tell you to do. How would that work if you do it in the real world? And you read the literature, and when you go beyond the textbooks, you find all sorts of things that undermine what you get taught in the textbooks in a very drastic way. So the point that this lecturer, Frank Stiller, is, of course, years later still a close friend. Frank explained to us what's called the theory of the second best. Has anybody heard that at all? Okay. It's won the Nobel Prize, one of the few Nobel Prizes in economics actually deserved, for one of its developers. And the argument was that imagine you have a world where you're 2 steps away from what economists define as nirvana. So you've got everything except you have trade union, and you have a trade union selling labour to an oligopolistic or monopoly cartel of employers. And what you therefore get is, do you get supply and demand equilibrium out of that? And the answer is no, you don't. You get a position where what they call the 2 marginal factors equating to each other gives you the actual outcome, but it's indeterminate. So there's in the situation where you have a trade union trying to set the wages on one side and an oligopoly of labour buyers on the other, you get an indeterminate range which depends upon bargaining power. Now, economists are trained to say that if you get to the stage where there's no trade unions and no monopolies, you reach nirvana. Okay? What they said was, what happens if you may take one step? So you abolish either the trade union or the monopoly. What happens to social welfare? And the conclusion of the theory of the second best was, it gets worse. Okay? So you take one step towards nirvana and you end up one step closer to hell. And I still vividly remember having that explained to me in the first year lecture, and I thought, that's crazy, because it's taken something which looks logical, which then says, well, let's take part of the real world into account, the existence of monopolies, the existence of trade unions, and then put that into this equation, and then say, what happens when we try to reform from the real world now towards this nirvana? We make things worse. Okay? There's got to be something wrong with the theory. So that's when I, very radically, within a matter of about 6 weeks, I went from being a believer in the theory to thinking it's all nonsense. But what often happens with people who do that is they exchange one religion for another. And I had a very intriguing experience years after I left university. I'd become an academic, and I bumped into one of the students who'd been part of the group that we then formed to campaign for the reform of economics teaching at the University of Sydney. And this guy was a bloke, there's a bit of a story behind this. I know I'm jumping all over the place, but I hope this is of interest. In 1971, I began university in 71. Halfway through university in 71, I had the theory explained to me. At the end of that year, I went and joined a trade union when I worked in a part-time job. So it was a complete denial of what I would have done just 6 months earlier, having had this idea exposed to me. And I then started reading the literature of economics and going below the textbooks and realising that was only one of many, many flaws in the theory that we simply weren't being taught. So anybody who was accepting this stuff reading the textbooks and thinking it described the theory accurately, and two things: believing the theory was accurately described by the textbooks, and believing the theory accurately described the real world. I realised very rapidly neither of those were true. The textbooks pasted over all the flaws in the theory, and the theory was... There's a wonderful comment from American humorist called Mention. You may have heard, some of you may have heard the name. And he said, to every human problem, there's a solution that is neat, plausible, and wrong. And that, to me, characterises economic theory in general. So the textbooks didn't describe the theory accurately, and the theory didn't describe the real world at all accurately. Put the two together, and I could see a mess evolving out of it. There then was Australia at that stage was involved with the Vietnam War. All this rebellion was on campus. We then made the sensible decision, finally, to kick out the Conservative government that took us into the war and be pulled out of the war in one day. And then with all this energy of student revolt, and during a time of economic boom, all the energy that was directed toward the anti-war movement got directed towards challenging what we were being taught, back in the days when students actually did challenge what they were taught. And we led the student revolt began in philosophy over the teaching of feminist thought. The staff wanted to have a course on the philosophical aspects of feminism. The professor blocked it, the faculty voted for it, the vice-chancellor blocked it, etc., etc. They called for a strike, and within about 6 weeks, about 1/3 of the university was on strike over this whole issue, and the strike in economics grew out of that as well. So that's my background of being a rebel here. But back to the incident with one of my fellow rebels some years later on a bus in Sydney. He was a doctrinaire Marxist. So he'd given up neoclassical and he'd become a Marxist. And this is quite a common pattern that I found. And I couldn't understand what's going on here. Why does somebody who rejects a particular false explanation of reality become wedded to another explanation which also has its flaws? And we were chatting on the bus. We had never really spoken because I just found this real barrier. I'm quite a critic. He was somebody who accepted another religious faith effectively. And he said, I still remember the day in which I found Marx. And I thought, what's going on? For a conversion from one religious belief to another religious belief. Now, that's okay when we're actually discussing religion, but it's dangerous when we're discussing how we think our society actually functions. And unfortunately, that's what's happened in economics. We have effectively had religious wars over a description of capitalism, one of which says it's a perfect system, and if we get rid of all these non-market interventions, it'll work brilliantly, and another saying it's doomed to fail, and we're going to go to socialism, which will be an improvement. Both are totally wrong. But I've been trying throughout my whole career to bring about a degree of realism to economics and say we need to understand the economy as a dynamic system. And economists themselves believe they've done that. They have developed what they call dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models of the economy. Anybody heard that term before? DSGE? Okay. And they have, it's incredibly hard to build a DSGE model. It takes a huge amount of intellectual labour to go through the steps you need to do to derive one of these models. And it's so demanding now that you don't have a chance to think of any form of criticism. If you learn how to do it, that's all you know about economics. And this particular approach to economics, which was like an exaggeration of the mainstream conservative stuff I was fighting against. And by the way, saying conservative or radical, I'm not talking about political, pro-Labor or pro-conservatives in the English situation or anything like that. It's a vision that capitalism is a perfect system. That's what I see as being the conservative element of it. And this belief system, when you look at it, evolved out of the 18th century battle that we had between the socialists and the capitalists over that period when capitalism itself was evolving. And we used to have a school of thought called classical economics. And that school of thought was what gave birth to Marx, but it also originally gave birth to Adam Smith and Ricardo, who were staunch defenders of capitalism. And their battle, their ideological battle at the time, was to try to take us from a feudal society and bring about a market-dominated one. And that battle was against feudal restraints, the incredible political limitations that were placed on people by their social class into the feudal system. moving through to the more fluid class system of capitalism. It's still a class system. So Ricardo and Smith supported that. Marx used the arguments of the classical school to argue for the abolition of capitalism. And then out of that grew the economic theory that now dominates our universities, called neoclassical economics. And neoclassical as a term was actually invented by one of the critics. So it was actually a term of abuse. But they thought it was a nice old term, so they called themselves neoclassical. And that's the stuff that most of us have who else has studied economics to any level? A few have, okay, so what, first year university, second year, that sort of thing? Yeah, okay. Supply and demand curves, etc., etc., okay. That vision has enormous mathematical flaws, but is so nice and plausible. Downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, point of intersection, price and quantity are both set. It becomes a mind, or what's his name? Not Daniel Dennett, but one of the Richard Dawkins, who was the person who was arguing for evolution, the concept of evolution as a way to understand human society and nature in general. He called it a meme, in the sense that there's genes which reproduce our species and we blend, and memes live through generations, or genes live through generations. And he argued what he called the selfish gene, so the gene itself reproduces itself through the vehicle of the body. He would find himself fighting creationists all the time. And he said, what you see with the creationists, they have an idea in their head which reproduces itself and conditions everything that comes in and repels anything which is anti that particular way of thought. So he talked about memes as mental ideas. And neoclassical economics has this very powerful meme of intersecting supply and demand curves. And that vision, it's plausible, it's neat, and it's wrong. And I want to give you a bit of explanation as to why that is the case. Because when you think about the idea of supply curve rising, you know, that's a huge part. Have you done that to draw the upward sloping supply curve? Why does it slope upwards according to the theory? Do you remember?
Because demand increases.
Pardon?
Demand increases.
Pardon?
Demand increases.
Well, demand increases, but supply can get cheaper.
If you pay people more, they'll produce more. Yeah. There's more people who want to produce it.
Yeah, that's the rationalisation we all make, but it's not what the theory argues. Okay? What the theory argues is that there's a certain, you have two factors of production needed to produce output. You have labour and capital. Okay? And one of them is fixed. Capital clearly being the one you'd make fixed. To produce more output, you've got to add more labour to a fixed amount of capital. And as you do it initially, you might get rising productivity. So imagine you have a firm which digs holes in roads. I imagine you've got a few of those in Brussels, from what I've seen. Or supposedly fills them in. We might have one worker with 6 jackhammers. Okay? So what you do is you hire that one worker, and that one worker operates 6 jackhammers. Can you see the flaw in the theory already? Okay. And then you have 2 and they operate 3 each, and 3 and they operate 2 each, and then finally you get to 6 who have 1 each, and then you have more labour than that. You have 20, you might have 12 workers, each 2 workers working on 1 jackhammer. It doesn't make any sense at all. The theory argues you can add a variable amount of labour to a fixed amount of capital. As you start getting past an optimal point, where, like for example, 1 worker per jackhammer, I'd imagine that's the optimal point, wouldn't you? Then you can dig more holes with more than 1 worker per jackhammer, but not twice as many holes each time. That's their explanation for the rising supply curve. Now, I hope by giving that analogy you can see that it's total nonsense. You don't work that way at all. If you have 6 jackhammers and 1 worker works 1 jackhammer, and when you get extra business, you hire a second worker who works a 2nd jackhammer with 4 remaining spare. And when you get to having 8 workers, you hire 2 more jackhammers from somebody else. So what you get is constant cost. Okay? The reasons we actually use to rationalise this are things like having to pay overtime and so on and so forth, and that stuff. Okay? But when you look at how a factory is designed to produce its maximum output, maximum efficiency, when it's being used to maximum utilisation, when you're about 95% utilisation. The engineers design factories so they get more efficient as you increase the volume of output. Who's worked in a factory job here? Anybody? Production lines. You know, have you been in a factory, I was actually working in a wine factory at Christmas. That's what I call overcapacity. All the lines are working, People are bumping into each other, taking bottles off the lines and so on. But they don't throw, when you're in June as opposed to Christmas time, one of those lines is not used. It's there because you need it for Christmas. So you can expand the output and productivity without, you don't lose productivity. So the idea of a rising supply curve is logically false. And when you do empirical research on it, it's empirically false. There have been about 150 research papers looking into what is the shape of the supply curve for the average firm. 95% of those studies, no, 100% of the studies have said that between 89 and 95% of firms have falling marginal cost. So if you derive a supply curve from that, you're going to get a downward sloping curve, not the upward sloping one you see in the textbooks. So that's logically false. Now the demand curve, we derive this idea of a demand curve by talking about an individual trying to maximise their utility. You've been through that exercise, any of you? Okay. That then imagines we can scale up from the individual. We derive all these conditions for an individual having a downward sloping demand curve. We derive them up to the macro level and we get the same result. And they do a similar thing for the firm. They start from the same concepts for the firm and derive up the supply curve. But what that's arguing is that we can explain the macroeconomy effects we see by understanding an individual and then extrapolating an individual to the national scale. That's what goes on. So I want to give you an example here to point out why that's false, why that's crazy. You're all drinking fluids around this table. Okay? Most of that fluid being water. Okay? If economists were right, you have to start from the micro to derive the macro. Then to explain the properties of water, you'd have to explain the properties of an individual molecule of H2O and then extrapolate that up to explain the macro properties we see of water. So there would be, for example, some conditions under which a water molecule would turn into an ice molecule. Other conditions under which a water molecule becomes a steam molecule. And my favourite, of course, there must of course be a snowflake molecule. That's nonsense. Okay? The reason water has its properties is because of interactions of more than one molecule. You can't explain water by explaining a single molecule of H2O. You've got to talk about the interactions of all these molecules to understand them. Now, economics has this flaw of believing you must derive from the macro and you can get smoothly from the macro to the micro to the macro level. And that's completely false. That's where a large part of the errors come from. That's the foundation of the theory that our students get taught. And then as part of that, what you try to argue is that all exchanges are effectively barter. So you might be paying money for the meal tonight or money to Full Circle for the event. But what you're actually doing is bartering your labour in return for hearing me talk for half an hour. It's a barter transaction. And economists are taught at first year university that relative prices, the price you pay for something in euros or pounds, doesn't matter. What all matters is the relative price, so the price you pay for this in terms of a standard commodity. So it treats money as a form of a commodity and says that all exchanges are effectively barter and therefore you can ignore the monetary system. Now the way this is done is to give students an illustration of a single individual facing a set of relative prices and an income level, and then you double the individual's price in income and double all prices, and you're asked what happens, and the technical answer is nothing, because twice as much income, twice the price of both the products you're looking at, you'll buy exactly the same amount, and that mean gets put inside their heads. And they then think, well, you don't need to worry about the monetary system. Money is effectively what they call a veil over barter. So they then, the theoretical role that this approach to economics has for money and for the monetary system is it determines the inflation rate. That's all. And they say the government's the only source of money creation in one of two ways. The government can create money by running a deficit, which of course they're against, or the government can, by giving money to, say, a welfare recipient, that welfare recipient goes to the bank and deposits that money in the bank. That deposit then creates some money in the banking system, and the banking system hangs on to, say, 10% of that money and lends out another 90%, and ultimately there you get a 10-for-1 creation of money out of the government giving a dollar payment to somebody. Ultimately 10 times as much of that is created by the banking system. But the government's in control of both the injection of money that starts the whole process and the ratio that determines how much money is actually created. That's the mental picture they have. Now, that vision that absolute prices don't matter, and that vision of money creation are complete farces. They're both totally wrong. So to give you an idea of why the relative pricing is wrong, if you live in a world without debt, so there's no debt whatsoever, and if money is something which is independent, nobody in the system creates it, it just exists, and we transfer it between each other. It's like a measuring stick which is not affected by changing the amount that exists. Okay? So in that situation, yes, you can double all prices and incomes quite easily without causing any distribution of income between people that will change the outcome. But if you live in a world where there's debt, even without banks being the creators of that debt, some of you are going to be debtors and others are going to be creditors. So when you try to double all prices and double all incomes, what do you do to the price of money? Okay. Do you double the price of money? Well, that's going to make the creditors better off. Do you keep it constant? That'll make the debtors better off. You simply can't do that exercise when you include that there's money in the system, which exists as something that also involves debt. So that whole mental exercise is a wrong starting point. It said, let's assume money doesn't exist, therefore we're going to prove that money doesn't matter. Okay. Slightly unrealistic. But the trouble is, anybody who's been through this whole inculcation, I wouldn't call it an education process, but an inculcation process, ends up believing that. And then about the role of banks. Banks are then treated as something neutral. They talk about what's called money neutrality. Have you heard that term? Okay. So the dilemma that a mainstream economist has for the financial crisis of 2008 is trying to explain why something which would only cause changes in nominal values, changing inflation, had an effect on the real economy. That's the dilemma they face. How do they explain that? So they're now getting themselves in all sorts of contortions trying to explain that phenomenon. But what they're doing is effectively they're trying to explain a meteor or craters on the moon as astronomers when we know that the Earth is, when they believe the Earth is the centre of the universe. They've got a vision of the world just like Ptolemaic astronomy. It's neat, it's plausible, and it's wrong. So I want to talk about a more realistic vision of the economy, and that's where banks and debt and money matter in an essential way. And one of the ways that they matter is if you just pay for this function using their credit card. Who swiped their credit card? Okay. Who used their savings account? Those of you who used their savings account simply transferred existing money from one point to another. You didn't change the aggregate amount of money. Those of you who swiped a credit card created, thank you, debt for yourself and cash in full circles account. You actually created money by that borrowing act. Now the way that the mainstream ignores that is to say, well, banks are just intermediaries. Banks operate to enable, introduce savers who have money that they don't want to spend to borrowers who don't have enough money to spend, and the bank charges a fee in the middle. That's the mythical model they have of how banks actually operate. And as august an institution as the Bank of England has finally come out and said that's nonsense, in a wonderful paper in 2014, almost as though they wrote an open letter to the economics profession. They said that is a myth. That is, banks originate. Banks are not facilitators of loans between one agent and another. They are loan originators, and when they originate a loan, they write an entry as an asset on their books, the debt that you owe to them, and they record an identical amount of money in your deposit account or the deposit account of the person you're doing the buying from, and that creates money. Now, their vision of banks being loan facilitators, people who intermediate between savers and borrowers, means that if one person spends money or borrows money to spend, their spending power goes up, but the person they borrow from has less money to spend. So one cancels the other out, and therefore you can forget about credit at the aggregate level. But when you say credit actually creates money and also creates demand, then total demand in the economy is no longer just the turnover of the money we already have in our pockets. It's the turnover of that money, which effectively we record as GDP, plus new debt. And the new debt is effectively credit. So if you go from having, this is one of the cases where what applies at the individual level also applies at the social level. So if you increase the amount of money you have by borrowing money, you create money and you create demand, and that aggregates to the national level. So to understand the total demand of the economy, you have to add GDP plus change in debt, which is effectively GDP plus credit. Now that entire dynamic was ignored by the mainstream economists who run our central banks. And so while they were obsessing about the level of government debt and saying it can't exceed 60% of GDP over here in the European Union, and you can't have a deficit of more than 3% of GDP, at the same time they were ignoring an enormous increase in private debt. Now that increase in private debt, because that actually creates credit and creates additional demand, that gives you a boom. But that boom comes at the price of accumulating more and more private debt. Now there's one big difference between us as individuals and the government. Can you think what it is? We don't own our own bank. At some point we can't continue servicing that debt. It gets beyond our capacity to service, or we get worried about the burden, or we have a failed venture, or other people who owe us money fail themselves and we lose our cash supply. So some level of debt, around about the 1.5 times GDP level it tends to be, that growth in credit comes to an end. And when it comes to an end, there's a catastrophic fall in demand. I'll try to give you this is going to be really bad of me when you've had a few glasses of wine here, but I'll try to give you a numerical example to make that point. So imagine you have an income of let's say 1,000 euros, let's say an economy with a GDP of 1,000 euros, 1,000 somethings, 1,000 being the GDP. And the debt level at the same time is 100% of GDP, so debt's also 1,000. And GDP is growing by 10% per annum, so 1,000 this year, it's going to be 1,100 next year. And you have debt growing by 20%, so twice as fast as GDP. So over that year, debt's going to go from 1,000 to 1,200. Okay? So total demand that year is going to be 1,200. Okay? But the next year, GDP is going to be 1,100. Now what happens if people stop borrowing that year? Then the next year demand goes from being 1,200 to 1,100. You can have a huge plunge in demand just because people stop borrowing. You don't even need them to try to reduce their debt levels. The mere fact that they stop borrowing can cause a downturn in total demand. That's what caused the financial crisis. And that was completely ignored by the central banks of the world because they didn't think private debt mattered because their education and economics said it can't matter. So that's what they saw as a black swan, an unpredictable event, a shock from outside the economy. So that's what caused the crisis. Now the aftermath of the crisis is the global economy, the private sector, is carrying a level of private debt that is equivalent to or greater than the peak level achieved during the Great Depression. So in that situation, the willingness to take on more debt, which creates credit, is almost zero. And consequently, what is a standard part of demand a standard part of demand all through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s of rising debt, rising faster than GDP, that source of demand disappears. When that source of demand disappears, you have a slump. You can't hire as many people when your demand predominantly is coming just out of GDP than you can hire when you have it coming out of GDP plus credit. That's what's caused the crisis. Now in the aftermath, we have central banks trying to revive their model of the economy. They're not trying to revive the economy because they don't know what that is. So everything they're doing is designed to revive their model. Okay? Now their model says that we need to stimulate demand by encouraging people to borrow. Okay? Not realising we're already in far too much debt to be able to do that in the first bloody place. But they're doing all these things that their textbook tells them will cause the banks to lend more money, the public to borrow it. So one of them is increasing reserves using what they call QE, quantitative easing. Now what QE did in most countries was buy bonds off the banks. And what happened then, the banks would have bonds, mortgage-backed securities, that sort of thing, which normally central banks wouldn't buy. They'll only buy and sell treasuries to try to manipulate the money supply, using what they call open market operations. But in the crisis, they buy mortgage-backed securities as well, because they were trying to do two things. They were trying to reduce the cost of money by dropping interest rates, and thereby reducing interest rates they thought that encourage borrowing, okay, stimulate demand that way. They also thought that by giving the banks reserves, more reserves than they need, that would cause them to lend the reserves out. And you'll find Bernanke talking precisely about that, saying they're giving the banks an extra $1 trillion, and that should stimulate. He didn't actually use numbers like this, but that's what he's arguing. $1 trillion of additional reserves should cause $10 trillion of additional lending. And I can give you a quote from that from one of the world's greatest orators, Obama. If you take a look back and see Obama's speech to the American people in about February of, no, it would have been April of 2009, he was explaining the TARP program in his brilliant way. Oratory, not content, unfortunately, but the oratory is brilliant. He said a lot of Americans say that the money that we're giving to the banks would be better off going to them. Where's my bailout, they ask. He said the truth is that an extra dollar in banks can lead to 8 or 10 more dollars being lent into the economy, a multiplier effect that will stimulate the economy further. That's straight out of first year textbooks. The idea of reserves, extra reserves, causing more lending, the whole idea of a depositor putting money in the bank hangs a certain amount and so on. That violates what's known as the fundamental law of accounting. So economists who should know something about accounting don't. And they put forward a model of money creation which violates what's called the law of accounting. They give you an idea of why it violates that law. If you think about a bank is a double entry bookkeeping machine. It records assets on one side, which fundamentally the loans it creates plus the reserves the government puts into its system on one side. On the other side are its liabilities, which are fundamentally your deposit accounts. And then the gap between the two is the bank's equity. That's the basic structure of a bank. Now, if you're going to lend out reserves, that means you've got to reduce your reserves. If you reduce your reserves, your assets fall. If your assets fall, your liabilities have to fall. But if you're going to lend money, your liabilities have to rise. So it's logically impossible for the banks to lend out their reserves. They can't do it, which is why the reserves have mounted up as much as they have done. And my analogy for this is that reserves are a bit like oil in a car. So you have a car that runs out of petrol. What does an economist do? He fills it full of oil. And he assures you that over time, that amount of oil will cause 10 times as much petrol that will cause the car to be able to go the extra distance. It doesn't. The oil circulates completely independently to the petrol. And in that sense, reserves are the bank accounts of the private banks at the central bank that enable them to settle all the transactions we create by buying between each other. So if you banked with Barclays and you banked with Lloyds, when you made your transfer, there also had to be a transfer of reserves between Barclays and Lloyds to put the money from one place to another. They're two separate circulating systems, but one does not cause the other. What lending does is increase an asset for the bank and increase its liabilities at the same time, and that's quite simple and logical. That's what banking lending is all about. So central banks have been following the economics textbook, and they're amazed that it doesn't work in the real economy. So the first stage was QE. Now we're going to negative interest rates. We've all seen that one. How many countries? Does Belgium have negative interest rates on the reserves? Not yet. Okay. Switzerland's got minus 0.75, I think, is the rate it charges on reserves. So what that rate is actually set on the reserve balances of the private banks at the central bank. Now the theory that the economists had was by putting negative rates on reserves, that would encourage the banks to lend those reserves. So they do one of two things. They either treat the reserves as hot potato they wanted to lend to the public, which they can't do, that fails. But the second thought is, well, they might actually put negative rates on deposits and charge people to deposit money at banks. If your bank started charging you money to deposit, what would you do? You'd take the money out, wouldn't you? So what the banks do instead is they put up the rates on the captive assets they have. By putting a negative rate on reserves, those huge reserves now, which were trivial before QE began, but they're now gigantic for most countries in the world, most private banks in the world. By putting negative rates on those reserves, the banks have responded by increasing their mortgage rates for their existing customers and putting up mortgage rates. So rather than encouraging lending, it's actually made lending more expensive and reduced lending. So that's why I said the banks are making up the rules as they go along, following a textbook which is completely false. So a major objective I've had is to say, if we're going to, we first of all, to reform the economy out of the crisis we're now in, we have to understand how it functions. And there are separate, there's another school of thought in economics called post-Keynesian economics, which for all its flaws, and it does have flaws, is more realistic about the nature of money and more realistic about the dynamics of a capitalist economy. And so there is an alternative body of thought. We're not left totally in the dark if we abandon these neoclassical ideas. But one thing which I've been arguing for about half a decade now is we have to literally physically reduce the level of private debt. If we don't reduce the level of private debt, we won't get out of the crisis. Now there's two ways you can reduce private debt. You can pay it down yourself or go bankrupt. Three ways, okay? That reduces demand. If you pay off your debt, just like extending your debt in your credit card creates money and creates demand, paying off your credit card reduces money and reduces demand. So the problem about the private sector trying to delever on its own is it actually reduces demand in the process, which is why depression can last for as long as they do. But another way to do that is for the use of the government's money creating capacity. And this is where we have a bad analogy in our heads, and it's not just the economists that have it, it's also the public in general. We tend to think about the government being like a household. And we have this myth that says, well, a household should balance its books or preferably save money, therefore the government should do the same thing. That's the mental analogy we go through. But as I pointed out at the beginning, none of you own your own bank. When you take on debt, you have got an obligation to an independent institution you have to repay. But the government owns its own bank. So if the government decides to create money, it effectively, the cost that it incurs can be just internal to the government itself. It could be a book entry between the Treasury and the central bank. So it would be quite possible for the central bank and the Treasury together to decide to create money as an asset on the, create money by putting money directly into our private bank accounts. And then I would have which we call people's QE. My additional condition there is to say I would want that money to be, if the recipient was in debt, then they would have to pay their debt down. So they don't get any money, they get their debt cancelled to that degree. But do it across the entire population, independent of whether people are debtors or savers. If they're savers, they have no debt to cancel, they get a cash injection. So you don't benefit people who are speculators over those who didn't speculate. Everybody gets the cash injection, but you use it to reduce the private debt level. Now, a big problem for this, for people to accept it intellectually, is we have an idea about debt that really relates to what happens between us as individuals. So if I borrowed somebody's pen here to sign a book, which hopefully I'll sell some later, and didn't return the pen, I've stolen a pen. That person had to either earn it, well, I know you basically took it from the European Union bureaucracy. But if you bought it yourself, I've stolen your pen, which you had to earn money to buy, and it's really a theft in that sense. And that's the mental picture we put for not paying banks back. But banks create money by double entry bookkeeping. That's all there is to it. So it's not a case of taking something that had to work really hard to save and distribute. It's correcting excessive entries both on the asset and the liability side of their ledger. We want to wipe that balance out, and we can do it just by a bookkeeping entry. And my favourite example of how much money is based simply on bookkeeping was a New Zealand, little New Zealand down to the west of Australia. Was it west or east? It's over that side anyway. There was a New Zealand service station, a petrol station owner, who applied for an overdraft from his bank of $100,000. And he was approved. And the next day he checked his bank account and he had a $10 million overdraft. He told his girlfriend, can I use French here? He said to his girlfriend, we're fucking rich. And he said, let's get out of here, withdraw $7 million and move to China. Now, what happened? How did that money get created? How did 100,000 become 10 million? What do you think happened? Has anybody ever worked in a bank? Have you seen a bank keyboard? You know it's got a double zero? The clerk who typed in the numbers would have gone 100, 000, not pressed the decimal point, or the decimal point jammed, or the keyboard was defective, 00, and by the keyboard operation created 10 million rather than 100,000. Now, there's no other industry in which you can do slightly less labour and create 100 times as much. Okay? That's what actually happens with money. Once you get that in your head, it becomes quite a simple operation to say, let's cancel debt. Let's do something which re-gigs the system and gets us back to a base level again and lets us move forward. So it's nothing, we should not be using our personal vision of interpersonal debt as a vision as to what we can do with the banking sector. And once we have that, it becomes a fairly easy operation to say, let's get the central bank to create this money so that it can cancel private debt without benefiting debtors over savers, reset the system and start again. But we also have to stop the banks profiting by funding Ponzi schemes. We have to stop the banks making their money by real estate speculation, because at the moment 90% or 95% of money is created to finance real estate speculation. And that means our money production, money creation, has become the byproduct of funding a Ponzi scheme. Because that very lending is actually what drives up prices, which sucks people back into borrowing more money. I'm happy to say Belgium hasn't got caught up in that particular game. It's your corporations that have borrowed huge amounts of money rather than your household sector. But in most of the world, that's what's created in the last 20, 25 years. And that's why we're caught in this trap right now. So we can't allow that to continue. So I'd also argue in favour of policy changes which meant that bank lending was limited not on the supposed income of the borrower, but on the income of the asset they were buying. So you'd have a much stronger link between the income earning capacity of what we were buying and the amount of money we borrow to buy it. And I'd also want to make it possible for banks to profit by lending to entrepreneurs. Because the ultimate good reason for banks and private banking to exist was given by Joseph Schumpeter almost a century ago. And he said that what banks should do is provide money to entrepreneurs who have good ideas but no money. You want those ideas to be turned into actual products. So they need to, they can turn that money, they turn those ideas into products if they get money. So his vision of a bank was effectively a form of venture capital. I would like to give banks the capacity to lend and not take a loan position with an entrepreneur, but an equity position. And then if they take a loan position, the reason they won't lend to entrepreneurs is 4 out of 5 entrepreneurs are going to fail. They'll lose their money. The one that succeeds, they'll get interest on the principal they lent to that money, which is a trivial return. So the basic decision is don't lend to entrepreneurs. But what if banks could lend to take an asset, take an equity position in the firm? And they'd lose on the 4, they'd live 100% of their money in the 4 out of 5 that fail, or they'd get some back, but basically write that off. But the one that succeeds, they make a fortune. And that venture capital transformation of banking would mean banks would have to work, they'd have to actually understand what entrepreneurs are doing, know what the ideas are like, evaluate them sensibly. And we can think about crowdsourcing ways of doing that in the modern world as well. But banking would become creative again rather than what it's become, which is a parasite on the economic system. But it's only become a parasite courtesy of economists not understanding the economy and those people being in charge of our central banks. Thank you.